So when we say TOC or test of control, so tests of control are performed to obtain evidence about the design effectiveness of internal control system and whether the internal control system of the client is operating effectively. So remember, tests of control are applied only to controls when where we intend to rely. So if you do not intend to rely on the control on that process or system, then we no longer perform tests of control on that particular system. So because remember, on the first part of our procedure, so we understand the internal control of the system so to determine whether they are designed effectively. But that is not enough. Okay? So that is not enough to be a basis of the reduced substantive test or procedures. We still have to test the operating effectiveness of the control. So that's what TOCs are for. So not only to test the design effectiveness, but also to test their operating effectiveness. So we perform test of control. So in test of control, what we do is that we understand the nature of the control being implemented by the client. For example, the control is to check the credit worthiness of the customer. So it may be done by the client manually or using a system. And then we set certain attributes or characteristics of the control. So like for example, if the customer's total outstanding balance so breach its credit limit, then they cannot order anymore on account. So that the element wherein the client approves the credit or disapproves the credit of the customer would be a characteristic that we will test in our TOC. Okay, so we will check the documents whether there are any indication that credit is approved or disapproved based on the set procedures of the client. Okay, so to perform test of control, we obtain evidence such as inquiry, observation, and inspection. So observation and inspection of the documents. So signifying that the related control has been carried out. Okay. Now, in some instances, we may also perform reperformance. So reperformance means the independent execution of the auditor of the controls originally performed by the client personnel. Okay, but this is only warranted by circumstances. So usually, the performance of inquiry, inspection, and observation would be enough to test the control of the client. So as you can see, this test of control is very much similar to the one that we discussed earlier, the transaction walkthrough. So wherein we understand the process of the client and trace the transaction from the beginning up to the end. So in transaction walkthrough, so what we do is that we also inquire from the client. So ask them about the process or the system that the client is implementing. So we identify the control points in that particular process. And then we perform inspection and observation of documents. So normally the control would be implemented on those documents like in our example. So let's say that is credit approval. So for the related document would be the sales order of the customer being approved or disapproved by the credit department. So when there's an initial on the sales order for the approved or the approved sales order by the credit department, that means the control has been carried out. So that is also the same thing that we will perform on TOC or test of control. So whether certain characteristic or attribute of the control has been carried out. So therefore, sir, what is the difference of test of control from the transaction walkthrough that we have discussed earlier? So number one is their objective. So our objective in transaction walkthrough is to verify our understanding of the client's internal control and to become familiar with the documents or source documents that the client is using. In test of control, our objective is to test the design and operating effectiveness of the internal control. So as you can see, while the process is similar or the procedures are similar, so the objectives are different between the transaction walkthrough and test of control. Another difference is the number of items or samples involved. So usually in transaction walkthrough, So only one or few samples may be relevant. No? For example, if we trace the process from origination up to the end, so it may suffice one document or few documents related to the one process involved would be enough to perform the transaction walkthrough. Okay, so however, in test of controls, we need more than one or few documents to determine whether the control would be operating effectively. So because, for example, when we are performing transaction walkthrough, we are understanding the process, we just used one completed sales order. So in that completed sales order, so let's say the credit department indicated their approval. So we understood how the credit approval process worked from the beginning up to the end of the process. And that satisfies our objective for transaction walkthrough. However, for test of control, that one credit approval procedure would not be enough to conclude that the control is operating effectively. So we need to repeat the process over and over again until we have enough sample to justify our conclusion that the controls are operating effectively. So we will not just look on one sales order where credit approval has been obtained. No? So we have to obtain several documents from the same process to identify or determine whether that internal control process is consistently being applied repeatedly. Okay, so we will have to use more samples compared to transaction walkthrough. So in fact, the document that we use in transaction walkthrough can also be used as one of the documents in our test of control or TOC. But then again, no, one document would not be enough to satisfy our objective with respect to test of control. So when do we perform test of control? We normally perform test of control before our year-end audit procedure. So because remember, our year-end audit procedures would depend on the outcome of our test of control. So because if we verify that the controls are indeed operating effectively, so that could influence the amount of our year-end procedures, no, or substantive audit procedures. Now, with respect to the extent of the test of control, so what are the factors that could affect our test of control? First, it has direct relationship with the expected reliance on the internal control. So the more we expect to rely to a certain control, then the more extensive will be our test on that particular control. So for example, if we expect to rely on the payroll or the controls over the payroll system of the client, and we expect to perform fewer procedures, no, substantive procedures on that control, so that means we have to test extensively that related control. So compared, for example, if we still expect to perform a moderate amount of procedures, substantive procedures on that control, then we can test or we can perform less extensive tests and controls on that particular for that particular process, because at the end of the day, we still expect to perform a number of tests, substantive tests in that particular system. Okay, so the more we expect to rely on the control, then the more extensive will be the test of control. So the less that we expect to rely on that control, then the less extent will be also the test of the related control. So also, the extent of TOC will depend on the relationship with the deviation rate. So when we say deviation rate, so this is the rate at which the exceptions, no, or the deviations from the control would occur. So let's say, for example, we are testing the control over the credit approval. So out of 10 documents that we have tested, so let's say 3 documents were uh, absent of the related control, or were not performed of the related internal control. So let's say that we are looking for the initial of the credit department. So out of the 3 documents that out of the 10 documents that the client processed, 3 of the documents lack signature or initial of the credit department, and yet they were able to be processed by the client's system. Then therefore, the deviation rate would be 3 out of 10, or 30%. Okay, so that's an example of deviation rate. So the higher would be the deviation rate, then the more extensive will be the related test of control. So the lower the deviation rate, then the less extensive would be the test of control. However, if the deviation rate is too high, then we also have to consider whether reliance would still be appropriate. Okay, because it's possible that if the deviation rate is too high, like in my example, 30%, so that could be too much. So then the auditor can decide not to rely on the control altogether. So finally, so we evaluate the results of the test of control or TOC. So we evaluate whether the internal control system are designed and operating effectively. So our decision could either be that the preliminary assessment of control risk is supported or the preliminary assessment of control risk needs to be revised. So depending on the result of our test of control. So that is why on the next step, we need to reassess the control risk if we can still support our preliminary assessment. So based, for example, on the result of the test of control. So for example, based on the outcome of the test of control, our assessment of control risk remains at less than high. So meaning to say that the controls are operating effectively. Now, for example, we reviewed the internal control system of the client on a particular process. So let's say credit approval process or payroll process. So we saw that the controls of the client are good based on the design. So they were designed effectively. They adapt the best practices. However, that is not enough. So we still need what? To test the controls of the client. So because design effectiveness is not enough. So to rely on the internal control. So that is why we perform test of control, validate several documents, and check whether the control attribute is being carried out by the client personnel or not. So for example, in credit approval, so in my example earlier, so let's say that we validated a number of documents of the client to check whether the credit approval process is being carried out. And let's say that when we uh, perform test of control on a number of the client's documents, let's say approved sales order, and we have found that the controls are being carried out. So there's a signature of credit approval or disapproval on all the sales order of the client that we have tested, or the deviation rate is lower than our uh, acceptable deviation rate. So let's say we have set the deviation rate at 5% and we only found 1% deviation rate. So we decided that the control of the client is effective, then we can continue to follow the reliance approach. So the effect on our audit procedures would be we can use less effective procedures. For example, we can use substantive analytical procedures compared to test of details. So as to timing, so we can use interim testing instead of year-end testing. And for extent, we can use less samples compared to more sample. So this will be the effect of the reliance on internal control. So because we expect that good or effective internal control will result to less material misstatement, then we will also reduce the amount of substantive procedures that we will perform on that area. Now, so let's say we change our assessment to high control risk. So when we reviewed the control of the client, we found it to be designed effectively. But when we tested the control, we found out that it is not operating effectively. So we have found many deviation or many exceptions in our test of control. Then we will switch our approach to no reliance. So meaning to say the nature of our substantive test will switch to more effective procedures compared to less effective procedures. So for example, we will adopt more test of details compared to substantive analytical procedures. Our test will be done at or near year end, and the extent we will be using more samples compared to less samples. So that will be the effect of our reassessment of control risk. Now, as for the required documentation, so it will depend on our risk assessment. So for example, if the risk assessment is less than high, so meaning to say we assess the control risk at less than high, then we are required to document our understanding of the internal control of the client, as well as our control risk assessment that it is less than high, and the basis for our control risk assessment, and that would be our test of control. However, if our risk assessment is high, so we also need to document our understanding of the internal control as well as our control-based assessment that it is high. However, we don't need to justify anymore the why we chose the high control-based assessment. So because this is more conservative compared to less than high control risk assessment. So because when we assess risk assessment as high, then that means that we will be performing more substantive tests. So we need to justify ourselves only if we expect to perform fewer substantive tests. So because if we perform fewer substantive tests, then there should be a basis for performing fewer substantive tests, and that will be the test of control. Okay? But let's say, for example, our risk assessment is high. If our risk assessment is high from the very beginning, so for example, in our preliminary assessment, then we will not be doing any test of control in that particular scenario at all. So there will be no basis for control risk assessment in that particular area. So because there's no test of control done. Okay? So normally we will just have a basis once our initial assessment is less than high, then we will perform test of control and then we switch to high. However, test of control will no longer be performed if in the very first place our risk assessment is already high. So again, we need to support our assessment. So only if our risk assessment is less than high. So that is, we need to perform test of control and document it. And finally, the last part is determining the nature, time, and extent of our procedures. So we make a final assessment of the control risk. So before the conclusion of the audit, so we determine whether the assessment of control risk is confirmed. So like for example, by performing the test of control. And then we perform the substantive procedures. So based on our assessment of control risk. So the assessed level of control risk has direct relationship on the design of our substantive test. Meaning to say, the higher would be our assessment of control risk, then the more extensive would be our substantive test. So the lower the level of the control risk, then it can support fewer or lesser extent of substantive tests. So that is why end of day. So we said that we study and evaluate the internal control of our client. So to help us auditors to determine the nature, time, and extent of our procedures. So because effective internal control result to fewer material misstatement and therefore lower extent of audit procedures. On the other hand, the less effective the internal controls are, then the more possible that material misstatements could occur and therefore more procedures should be performed. We go to the last part of our discussion, which is the communication of deficiencies. So for this topic, now we will use PSA 260, so communication of audit matters with those charged with governance. So let's define deficiency. So deficiency or weakness is when a related control is unable to prevent, detect, or correct material misstatements on a timely basis. Or a necessary control is missing or not in place. Now, take note that not all deficiencies are reportable. So we have to consider the significance of the weakness or the deficiency before reporting it to management and those charged with governance. Okay? So let's, like for example, so let's say 1 out of 100 documents that we have tested, the client personnel failed to perform the related control. So if we believe that that is not significant or that is not material, then no need to report it to management or those charged with governance. So let's say it's just an isolated event. Okay. However, if the deficiency is being done repeatedly, so it causes material misstatement, then that deficiency or combination of deficiencies could already be considered significant or material. And in that case, we need to communicate those significant deficiencies in writing Okay, so in the internal control of the client to those charged with governance on a timely basis. So if appropriate, we can also report it to the management. Okay, so unless it's the management that is involved in that significant deficiency, then we will only communicate to the audit committee or to those charged with governance. So here's the summary of our required response. So with respect to communication of deficiencies to management and those charged with governance. So for control deficiency, so that means a specific control was not able to prevent or detect and correct material misstatements. So we communicate it if it merits attention. So normally to the management. Now, if you talk about significant deficiency, so this is considered significant but less severe than a material weakness, then we need to communicate it to those charged with governance in writing. If appropriate, we can also communicate it to the management. So if it's a material weakness, so there is a reasonable possibility of not preventing or detecting the related fraud or misstatement, then we communicate that to those charged with governance in writing also. And if appropriate, we can also communicate that to the management. So that ends our discussion on this part.